On a cold winter morning in New England, long before the Pacific became a battlefield, a quiet figure walked up the stone steps of the U.S. Naval War College. His uniform was crisp, his posture deliberate, but what caught the eye were the two missing fingers on his left hand, the silent scars of Tsushima. To the officers who passed him that day, he was simply another foreign visitor, but he had come for something far more important than lectures or ceremony. He had come to understand the forces that would shape the next great war. What he found in America was not merely a navy, but a nation powered by steel, by oil, by machines that never slept. He saw factories capable of turning peace into war overnight, and fields so vast and abundant that they could feed entire continents. And he understood, with a clarity that bordered on dread, that no amount of courage or tradition could compensate for the weight of such industrial might. What does a man do when he sees the future so plainly, yet knows his country will refuse to believe it? And what happens when the warnings are ignored? This is the story of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, and the tragedy he foresaw long before the first shot at Pearl Harbor. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto first arrived in the United States as a young officer, he did not yet carry the weight of prophecy on his shoulders. He came as a student, a man shaped by hardship and war, eager to understand a world far larger than the islands he called home. Harvard was his anchor point, but his true lessons unfolded far beyond the classroom walls. America in the early 1920s was restless, expanding, surging with a confidence born from victory in the First World War. It was a nation discovering the full power of its industry, and Yamamoto watched it with the attentive silence of a man who understood what such power could do in a future conflict. During school breaks, he traveled not as a dignitary, but as a wanderer, hitchhiking across dusty highways, talking to workers, engineers, and farmers. He absorbed the rhythms of a country built on abundance. In Texas and Mexico, he walked through oil fields that seemed to pump endlessly from the earth, each steel derrick a reminder that energy itself could be a weapon. He studied drilling systems, refining processes, and the sprawling pipelines that moved crude across vast distances. These were not merely industrial curiosities. They were, in his mind, the lifeblood of modern warfare. Pittsburgh stunned him in a different way. The steel mills glowed around the clock, rivers of molten metal feeding a production line unlike anything Japan could match. Annual American steel output exceeded 50 million tons. Japan produced barely a fraction of that. The numbers were not just impressive, they were terrifying. They revealed a truth Yamamoto could not ignore. American industrial power was not simply larger, it was operating on a scale Japan could not approach, even in its most ambitious dreams. He continued west toward the Great Lakes, watching freight trains pulling lines of coal and ore that stretched beyond the horizon. Railroads stitched the continent together, forming a logistical network capable of turning raw minerals into warships with astonishing speed. In the Midwest, farms rolled outward in every direction. One American farm, he realized, could outproduce entire Japanese villages. The surplus fed cities, and the cities fed factories, and the factories could be turned into engines of war whenever the nation demanded it. His visit to the small Japanese agricultural colony in Texas only deepened his understanding. Here, in fields once used to grow rice, oil now surged from the ground, a reminder that even small operations in America rested atop resources Japan could not replicate. Yamamoto spoke with workers, studied the economics of drilling, and asked questions about transportation and refining. Everything he saw pointed in one direction. Japan depended overwhelmingly on imported oil, and most of that oil came from the United States. By the time Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto returned home in 1924, the equation had become clear. The nation he served was rich in tradition and courage, but poor in the materials that defined modern war. The nation he had visited possessed an industrial capacity so vast that, if awakened, it could reshape the world. And he feared that one day it would. As the 1,920 seconds ended, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto returned to a navy facing a world it did not fully understand. Japan celebrated its victories in Asia, confident in its warrior spirit and expanding empire. Yet, beneath the patriotic rhetoric lay a harsher truth. Japan remained a nation short on iron, short on oil, short on the raw materials that defined modern war. And Yamamoto, armed with first-hand knowledge of American industrial power, knew the strategic clock was already ticking. His decision in 1924 to abandon the prestigious discipline of naval gunnery and transfer into naval aviation shocked many senior officers. Gunnery was tradition. Aviation was uncertain, dangerous, even seen as a novelty by conservative commanders. But Yamamoto had studied World War I's air battles while at Harvard. He had seen how aircraft could reach beyond the horizon, striking fleets long before battleship guns could fire. To him, aviation was not a gamble. It was the only path forward. At the Kasumigura Naval Air Training School, he pushed Japan's future pilots to their limits. Night flying became mandatory. Carrier landings had to be mastered with precision. Training accidents increased, and some pilots called his standards unreasonable. Yamamoto's response was icy and unwavering. A pilot who could not survive training would not survive combat. Many would later say that Japanese naval aviators became the best in the world because he refused to accept anything less. From training grounds to conference halls, Yamamoto carried the same uncompromising realism. At the London naval conferences of 1930 and 1935, he argued fiercely against the restrictive shipbuilding ratios imposed on Japan. Publicly, he demanded equality with the United States and Britain. Privately, he understood a more painful reality. Even if treaty limits vanished tomorrow, Japan could not hope to match the shipyards, steel mills, or energy resources of its potential adversaries. The gap in industrial capacity was too great, the foundation too uneven. It was a competition Japan could not win. As Japan marched deeper into China in the 1930 seconds, Yamamoto's warnings sharpened. He opposed the war, understanding that each advancing division consumed oil Japan did not possess and invited conflict with powers it could not challenge. His stance made him enemies. Radical nationalists branded him a coward. Newspapers hinted at treason. Assassination threats became so credible that the Navy assigned guards to protect him. To remove him from Tokyo's political crossfire and perhaps to save his life, Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai appointed him Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet in 1939. It was both an honor and a burden. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was now responsible for preparing Japan's Navy for a war he believed would end in disaster. The pressure grew unbearable in 1940, when Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe asked for his honest assessment of a war with the United States. Yamamoto did not hesitate. Japan, he said, could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, American industrial power would crush Japan's hopes. It was the most accurate prophecy of the Pacific War and the most tragically ignored. With diplomacy failing and nationalist rage rising, Yamamoto faced a final, agonizing truth. If Japan insisted on war, the only hope lay in a sudden, crippling blow. And so the road to the Pearl Harbor attack began, not with confidence, but with the resigned logic of a man who saw no other path left. The plan that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto ultimately delivered to Tokyo was bold, unprecedented, and perilous. For decades, Japanese naval doctrine had centered on luring the American fleet westward into waters near Japan for a decisive gun duel. Yamamoto dismissed the idea entirely. If Japan waited, he argued, the United States would bring to bear the full weight of American industrial power long before Japan could prepare its defenses. The only hope, thin as it was, lay in striking first, striking far, and striking hard enough to buy a few precious months. Preparation for the Pearl Harbor attack pushed Japan's aviators to the edge of human endurance. Torpedo pilots trained in shallow bays that mimicked the depth of Pearl Harbor, forcing their weapons to skim just below the surface instead of plunging into the mud. Dive bomber crews rehearsed steep, nerve-rattling descents onto mock battleships. Every maneuver had to be perfect. Every mistake threatened catastrophe. Training accidents mounted, and the cost in pilots and aircraft was steep. Yet Yamamoto accepted these losses. Better to confront failure in practice than in the narrow window where Japan's fate would be decided. At dawn on the 7th of December 1941, the attack unfolded with terrifying precision. Battleship Row erupted under waves of torpedoes and bombs. Arizona's magazines detonated in a column of fire. Oklahoma rolled onto her side. Sailors fought for air through inrushing water. More than 2,000 Americans died in minutes. By conventional standards, it was a stunning success, the kind of opening blow strategists spend lifetimes imagining. And yet, as radio reports reached the flagship, Yamamoto did not celebrate. The American carriers Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, were not in port. The submarine base, repair yards, and massive fuel storage tanks remained intact. Pearl Harbor burned, but American industrial power had not been crippled. For the next 6 months, Yamamoto's prediction came true. Japan ran wild across the Pacific, capturing Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. Japanese carriers struck into the Indian Ocean, sinking Allied ships with frightening skill. Newspapers in Tokyo proclaimed the rise of a new empire. But the victories masked a deeper crisis. Japan's oil reserves were dwindling. The captured oil fields required months of repair. Shipyard capacity was limited. Replacement pilots were undertrained. Every gain consumed resources Japan could not replenish. In the United States, the news of the Pearl Harbor attack tore through the nation with a force unmatched in its modern history. Before December 1941, Americans were divided over involvement in another global war. After the burning wrecks in Hawaii, the division vanished. A sense of unity, grim, resolute, and unwavering, swept across the country. And as America turned its gaze toward the Pacific, it reached instinctively for the weapon Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had recognized decades earlier: American industrial power. Detroit was the clearest symbol of this transformation. Factories that once produced automobiles retooled to build tanks, trucks, and armored carriers with astonishing speed. Assembly lines that had delivered civilian prosperity now delivered instruments of war. Workers labored day and night, many with sons already fighting overseas. To them, the war was not an abstract struggle across an ocean. It was personal, it was necessary, and it demanded everything they could produce. Shipyards along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts echoed with the clanging of steel plates as workers rushed to replace the ships lost in the early months of the conflict. Aircraft manufacturers expanded their facilities and trained thousands of new workers. Every industrial center in America became a node in a vast network of production whose scale dwarfed anything Japan could match. What Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had once studied as an academic truth had now become the backbone of national survival. Internationally, the early Japanese victories shocked observers but did not alter the long-term calculations of Britain, China, or the Soviet Union. Most global leaders understood what Yamamoto had tried to warn his own government. Japan's early triumphs did not erase its structural weaknesses. The world saw Japan's dramatic expansion, but also the strain it placed on a nation already short of oil, steel, and manpower. When the United States intercepted Yamamoto's flight plan in April 1943, American commanders faced a moral and strategic question. Should they strike at the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, even if doing so risked revealing their code-breaking success? Admiral Chester Nimitz approved the operation, not out of vengeance, but because he understood Yamamoto's irreplaceable role within the Japanese command. His death over Bougainville signaled more than the loss of a brilliant strategist. It symbolized the collapse of Japan's last hope for a war tempered by realism. For the world watching, the pattern was unmistakable. Industry had become destiny, and in a contest shaped by factories, oil fields, and logistics, the outcome was already written. In the final accounting of the Pacific War, long after the guns quieted and the smoke drifted away from the ruined cities, one truth emerged with almost painful clarity. The war had unfolded exactly as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto feared it would. For 2 decades, he had studied the engines of American industrial power, measured their output, and traced their implications. He had warned that courage, discipline, and brilliant tactics could not offset a nation capable of producing ships by the dozens, aircraft by the thousands, and fuel by the millions of barrels. No matter how daring the Pearl Harbor attack had been, it could not change the mathematics of modern war. And that is the tragedy at the heart of his story. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was neither warmonger nor pacifist. He was a realist in a nation swept up by pride, ideology, and the illusion that spirit alone could conquer steel. He understood that Japan was embarking on a road where victory in the first 6 months would be meaningless if the next 3 years belonged to America's factories. Yet his warnings, documented, repeated, unmistakably clear, could not overcome the momentum of a political and military system determined to chase a vision of empire. For American audiences today, especially those who lived through the echoes of that era, his story serves as more than a historical narrative. It is a reminder that even the clearest intelligence can be ignored, that leaders can choose what they wish to believe, and that nations sometimes silence the voices they most desperately need to hear. It also underscores a deeper lesson. The real power of a country lies not only in its weapons, but in its workers, its infrastructure, and its will to mobilize when history demands it. So we are left with a question that reaches far beyond the Pacific. What truths are we ignoring today because they are inconvenient, uncomfortable, or unwelcome? And what might the cost be if we fail to listen? If this story of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the Pearl Harbor attack, and the rise of American industrial power has given you something to think about, we invite you to join the conversation. Share your perspective below. Tell us where you are watching from. And if you value remembering the lessons that shaped our modern world, consider subscribing so you never miss the next chapter of our shared history. Some battles end. Their lessons do not.